623, 18 November 2020. This is going to be a bumpy one, but I was looking for other things to video about, and I found something in Blacklisted News, and it led me to just doing a cursory search, a really basic search that anybody can do, and I found some things. So we're going to start off with from BBC News 2019. The U.S. has spent $1.5 million a day since 2001 fighting the opium war in Afghanistan. So why is business still booming? Afghanistan is by far the biggest producer of opium in the world. According to the U.S. military, 90% of the world's heroin is made from opium grown in Afghanistan. November 2017 saw Operation Iron Tempest in Helmand Province. There were 9 strikes in total in this particular operation, each one taking out an individual building in a series of almost simultaneous explosions. The objective was to take out heroin laboratories at the heart of the Taliban's $200 million a year opium trade, and it was to involve some 200 similar strikes. In reality, though, was that despite excellent intelligence the multi-million-dollar campaign was having a negligible effect on the Taliban and the drug trafficking networks in Afghanistan. Dr. David Mansfield has studied the Afghan opium industry for more than 2 decades. He says heroin production leaves certain telltale signs, indicators, and he wasn't seeing any of them in this particular strike. Yet American forces were claiming the attacks were a success. Despite the incredible resources the American military was pouring in, Dr. Mansfield and his team were now convinced that the U.S. Air Force was using 21st century fighter jets to bomb little more than mud huts. When the U.S. and British forces invaded Afghanistan in 2001, poppies were grown on around 74,000 hectares or 285 square miles. That was in 2001. In 2019, the new figures, the whole time we've been there, so-called fighting this war, showed production has increased by more than 4-fold in 15 years. Now opium is being grown, or was being grown, on 328,000 hectares or 1,266 square miles. Keep all this in mind because because this is going to be a good wrap up at the end. And there has been another change too. In the past, the opium latex would be dried and smuggled out of Afghanistan as a sticky paste to be refined elsewhere. Now, Afghan and Western officials were estimating that half, possibly more, of Afghan opium was being processed into either morphine or heroin. It made smuggling easier and also massively increased the profits for drug traffickers and the Taliban, who are reckoned to take a tax of about 20% of the profits. The White House declared it was a national public health emergency in 2017, the opioid crisis in the United States. More than 2 million Americans are addicted to opioids, and opioid overdoses have become the leading cause of death in America, ahead of car crashes and gun violence. According to this article, the Afghan heroin is reckoned to make up only a tiny fraction of the U.S. market. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency claims as little as 1% of U.S. supply is from Afghanistan. It says virtually all the heroin used in America comes from Mexico and South American countries. I'm going to get into another article which also kind of illustrates why whatever they're saying is sketchy at best. Okay, so keep that in mind. Next article from TASS, or Russian News Agency, 2020. Now there's a lot of people in the States, mostly all liberals, that absolutely will swear by a Russian news agency if it comes to smearing anything having to do with the Trump administration. So why not trust them now after I read this? Moscow, July 5, 2020, from TASS. Some members of the U.S. intelligence, which accuses Russia of conspiring with Taliban members, are involved in drug trafficking from Afghanistan, said Russian President's Special Envoy for Afghanistan Affairs, Zamir Kabulov. Quote, "Those wonderful U.S. intelligence officers who accuse us of different things are involved in drug trafficking. Their planes from Kandahar, from Bagram, an airfield near Kabul, are flying wherever they want to Germany, to Romania, without any inspections," he said. "Every citizen of Kabul will tell you that. Everyone is ready to talk about that," end quote. Well, if we're to believe Russian news agency that somehow Russia is putting a hit on U.S. soldiers, I mean, that's who we're getting it from, right? That as if the militants don't need any other reason to attack United States forces and allied forces in Afghanistan to begin with. They actually tried to pull that. Well, should we believe this too? From the Washington Times, 2013. And this all builds. You actually have to activate grain matter. This all builds. As President Obama's troop surge began in 2009, so did new rules of engagement demanded by Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who was responding to local elders angry over deaths of civilians from NATO airstrikes and ground operations. This is my note. Remember, with the new rules of engagement, with those particular new rules of engagement under Obama, it also said that we had to warn the town that we were going into at least 24 hours in advance that we were coming, and then only search for who and what was specified beforehand. So, that being the case, and there's opium, heroin production in Afghanistan that we're supposedly trying to abate and stop, we're going to let this build. From Business Insider, 2014. An investigation by El Universal found that between the years of 2000 and 2012, the U.S. government had an arrangement with Mexico's Sinaloa drug cartel that allowed the organization to smuggle billions of dollars of drugs, while Sinaloa provided information on rival cartels. Sinaloa supplies 80% of the drugs entering the Chicago area and has a presence in cities across the United States. El Universal, citing court documents, reports that DEA agents met with high-level Sinaloa officials such as a person indicated before Castro, not Fidel, more than 50 times since the year 2000, up until the time that this report came out. Quote, the DEA agents met with members of the cartel in Mexico to obtain information about their rivals and simultaneously build a network of informants who signed drug cooperation agreements subject to results to enable them to obtain future benefits, including cancellation of charges in the U.S., reports El Universal, which also interviewed more than 100 active and retired police officers as well as prisoners and experts. One individual mentioned a Zambada Niebla. His lawyer claimed to the court that in the late 1990s, Castro struck a deal with U.S. agents in which Sinaloa would provide information about rival drug trafficking organizations, while the U.S. would dismiss its case against the Sinaloa lawyer and refrain from interfering with Sinaloa drug trafficking activities or actively prosecuting Sinaloa leadership. The agents stated that this arrangement had been approved by high-ranking officials and federal prosecutors, Zambada Niebla's lawyer wrote. After being extradited to Chicago in February 2010, Zambada Niebla argued that he was also, quote, immune from arrest and prosecution, end quote, because he actively provided information to U.S. federal agents. Zambada Niebla also alleged that Operation Fast and Furious was part of an agreement to finance and arm the cartel in exchange for information used to take down its rivals. It says, if true, that re-raises the issue regarding what Attorney General Eric Holder knew about the gun running arrangements. A Mexican Foreign Service officer told Stratfor in 2010 that the U.S. seemed to have sided with the Sinaloa cartel in an attempt to limit the violence in Mexico. El Universal reported that the coordination between the U.S. and Sinaloa, as well as other cartels, peaked between 2006 and 2012, which is when drug traffickers consolidated their grip on Mexico. The paper concluded saying that it's unclear whether the arrangements continued. The DEA and other U.S. agencies declined to comment to El Universal. From the Mazatlan Post, 2019. As the New American first reported in early 2011, a high-ranking operative with the Sinaloa cartel had outlined elements of the criminal agreements with U.S. authorities in official court documents. Quote, the government of the United States and its various agencies have a long history of providing benefits, permission, and immunity to criminals and their organizations to commit crimes, including murder, in exchange for receiving information against other criminals and other organizations. Trafficker Jesus Vicente El Vicentillo Zambada Niebla argued in U.S. court filings cited by El Universal. The New American has also reported extensively on the Zambada Niebla case and what it reveals. Experts quoted in the Mexican paper echoed other analysts who have spoken out in recent years, saying that the U.S. government scheming handed the Sinaloa cartel de facto status as the primary powerhouse. In fact, during the period when El Universal says the relationship between American officials and Sinaloa chieftains was the most active, 2006 to 2012, drug war-fueled violence in Mexico surged to unprecedented levels. I remember hearing about a lot of the killings and a lot of the displayed bodies. I remember that. There are numerous indications that despite official denials, top Mexican officials may have been aware of the schemes or even involved in them. Oh yeah, and also the Zetas, coming up from Mexico in through Texas and doing a hit in, I think it was a suburban Dallas neighborhood. Yeah. Also, part of the U.S. government's deal with Sinaloa, analyst and Zambada Niebla have said, was the Obama administration's Fast and Furious gun-running program to arm Mexican cartels at U.S. taxpayer expense. Most recently, a whistleblower from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, the BATFE, said that U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, killed with a Fast and Furious gun, was murdered by criminals working for the FBI. Quote, "It is clear that some of the weapons were deliberately allowed by the FBI and other government representatives to end up in the hands of the Sinaloa cartel," end quote, stated a motion filed in U.S. court by Zambada Niebla's defense team, adding that the U.S. government has documents showing that the weapons were provided by authorities pursuant to the agreement with Sinaloa. According to former officials and drug kingpins, the agreements between Sinaloa and Washington also allowed the criminal empire to ship multi-ton quantities of hard drugs across the border into the United States. In all, El Universal said there had been at least 50 meetings in Mexico between U.S. government agents and senior Sinaloa bosses, along with many more phone calls and emails. The criminal syndicate's leaders were given carte blanche to continue to smuggle tons of illicit drugs into Chicago and the rest of the United States, and were also protected by the U.S. government from arrest and prosecution. Zambada Niebla's court filings stated, adding that the U.S. government has the documents proving it. Indeed, quote, U.S. government agents aided the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, end quote. Now, I went through all that to say this. This is from Blacklisted News via Filter Mag. So, the United States is responsible for a lot of drug trafficking in the world and specifically at home. And this is from November 2020. The DEA, the same ones who are making drug deals literally with cartels, wants access to 130 million prescription records. Back in 2017, whoever this reporter is, reported on how the Drug Enforcement Administration's prescription monitoring program was tracking 60% of Americans' personal information and prescriptions. But now an article in Filter Mag revealed that the DEA wants unlimited access to millions of Americans' prescription records. Quote, the DEA is looking to expand its anti-diversion surveillance infrastructure by being able to search and analyze myriad patient behaviors for the vast majority of controlled and scheduled drug prescriptions, all accompanied by a rapid process for legally unveiling personally identifying information. In early September, the agency requested proposals for the creation of software capable of searching at least 85% of all U.S. residents' controlled substance prescriptions for certain patient behaviors, as well as prescriber and pharmacist practices. The DEA wants to give their agents unlimited access to patient de-identified data, whatever the hell that means, on filled or refilled prescriptions, daily supply, payment type, dosing information, and gender. The de-identified data the DEA will have access to includes things like a patient's gender, age group, city, state, zip code, and the number of instances of more than one Schedule II prescription drug at the same address. It also includes things like the distance between a patient and the pharmacy. The DEA's prescription monitoring program would let at least 1,100 DEA agents have access to the so-called de-identified patient prescription data simultaneously, and it would also have a streamlined subpoena process. Now, why would the DEA want to give 1,100 agents access to de-identified patient subscription data, and why would they want a streamlined subpoena process if they could not identify individuals? According to a 2016 NPR article, the DEA could be monitoring 119 million Americans taking prescription drugs. Nearly, according to NPR, nearly half of all Americans over the age of 12 take prescription pain relievers, tranquilizers, sedatives, or stimulants, according to a federal survey. And 16% of the time, those drugs are misused by nearly 19 million Americans. Health officials are calling for more drug treatment, but also for more care in prescribing drugs in the first place. The National Survey on Drug Use revealed that at least 119 million Americans took painkillers, tranquilizers, stimulants, and sedatives. A more recent study by Georgetown University's Health Policy Institute claims that at least 66% of the population, or 131 million Americans, are on prescription drugs. Whichever figure is correct, 119 million or 131 million, the obvious question everyone should be asking is, why does the DEA need access to millions of elderly and other Americans' prescription information? When the feds are allowed to create and use a surveillance program masquerading as a prescription monitoring program, no one is safe. Not the kids, not teenagers, not the elderly. So welcome to post 9/11, where the feds treat everyone taking prescription drugs like a suspect. As FilterMag warns, the DEA has a history of exploiting administrative subpoenas to build a mass surveillance apparatus. The DEA's 343 million license plate database is a perfect example of how the DEA has secretly created a national license plate surveillance network, allowing the DEA to scrutinize the percentage of patients receiving opioids, buprenorphine, or oxycodone scripts is horrifying. If you've ever had to fill out a prescription or pick one up for a family member, you know that they record your ID and all your personal information. Allowing federal agents to monitor anyone's prescription records without a warrant is a recipe for disaster. Quote, the idea that patient-level data is available to the DEA is quite frightening. We don't want to make people worry that their decisions will be monitored by this highly punitive federal agency, said Cooper, whomever that was in the article. If you've been inhabiting a space where you've been persecuted by the federal government for some time, and they now have access to your private medical information, there will be tremendous consequences for population health and health equity. So here's one example they give of how law enforcement could abuse the monitoring of 131 million Americans' prescription records. Imagine being involved in an automobile accident or being arrested for protesting police abuse, etc. Now imagine what would happen when the district attorney subpoenas your prescription drug history. Can you guess what the outcome would be once a judge or a jury is told about your prescription drug history? This is just one example of how everyone's lives could be affected by a federal prescription monitoring program. I have a particular issue with that, not this specifically, but if the United States government is enabling drug trafficking, specifically opioid drug trafficking into the United States, a logical conclusion is that they are in large part to blame for the opioid crisis. And now, an agency within this government wants to monitor your prescription fills. Anybody else see a problem with that? Because I do. First, we'll get you strung along, and then we'll monitor every step you make. It's good to be the king. Sig 23 out.